Have you ever wondered why you are the way you are? Why certain patterns follow you, no matter how much you try to change? Why you react the way you do, love the way you do, and even sabotage yourself in ways you don't fully understand? And first, it seems random, just personality, just life. But what if it isn't random at all? What if one of the most overlooked factors that shaped your entire psyche was the position you were born into, your birth order? It might sound simple, whether you were the firstborn, the middle child, the youngest, or an only child. But what most people never realize is that this one detail became the blueprint of how you learn to survive, how you learn to be loved, how you learn to exist in the world. It's not superstition, and it's not fortune-telling. It's the psychology of patterns, of unconscious roles, of identities so deeply woven into you that you don't even realize they're not really you. They're the role your psyche was forced to play from the very beginning. When you look at the frameworks of analytical psychology, the same. One's used to decode archetypes, shadow work, and the unconscious mind. It starts to become clear. Your birth order isn't just a fact. It's a symbolic imprint, a psychological contract you didn't choose, but that has shaped almost everything about you. Let's imagine for a moment that understanding the unconscious patterns linked to your birth order could explain why you carry certain wounds, why you attract certain types of people, why you face the same emotional struggles over and over, and why, despite everything you've learned, you still feel pulled back into versions of yourself you thought you had outgrown. Sounds dramatic, right? But once you begin to look at this through the lens of Jungian psychology, the shadow, the persona, the archetypes, it stops sounding like drama and starts sounding like the truth. In this video, we're going to explore how your birth order has shaped your unconscious mind, how it influenced the archetype you unconsciously stepped into, and how that pattern still affects your relationships, your self-worth, your fears, and your desires. But before we begin, if you're someone who values depth, meaning, and self-discovery, consider subscribing to the channel. We bring content that challenges surface-level thinking and helps you decode the invisible patterns shaping your life. Now, take a deep breath, because what you're about to discover won't just change how you see your birth order. It will change how you see yourself and the story you've been unconsciously living all along. When you were born, something happened that went far beyond genetics, far beyond your environment, far beyond even the expectations your parents had for you. Without realizing it, you were assigned a role, an unconscious identity, not just because of your personality or your natural tendencies, but because of the position you held within your family. Whether you were the firstborn, the middle child, the youngest, or an only child, that position became more than just a label. It became a blueprint, a silent psychological contract that began shaping how you saw yourself, how you behaved, how you coped, how you connected to others, and how you learned to survive. This isn't about astrology. This isn't a superstition. This is the deep psychology of identity. And while Carl Jung never explicitly formulated a theory of birth order the way Alfred Adler did, Jung's work on the formation of the self, the shadow, and the persona fits perfectly into this exploration. Because your birth order, whether you've ever thought about it consciously or not, became a massive contributor to the construction of your persona. The persona, according to Jung, is the mask we wear, the social identity we develop not because it's who we truly are, but because it's who we believe we have to be in order to be loved, accepted, and safe. And that mask often forms long before we even have language to describe ourselves. Think about it. The moment a first child is born, the child becomes the responsible one, the one who carries the weight of expectations, the one who must perform, achieve, and set the example, not because the child chooses this, but because the role is written before they can even speak. The middle child, often caught in the silent space between visibility and invisibility, no longer the precious firstborn, but not the cherished youngest either. They often adapt by becoming peacemakers, rebels, or chameleons, constantly shifting to find their place in a family dynamic that feels inherently unstable for them. And the youngest? The baby. The free spirit, the one who gets away with more, who feels both the blessing and the burden of lower expectations, sometimes protected, sometimes underestimated, but always shaped by being the last, the one who came into a family system already fully formed around others. Then there's the only child, a unique configuration, both the first and the last, both the center of attention and the sole carrier of family expectations. Growing up surrounded by adults, often maturing quickly, yet also struggling with loneliness, isolation, and the pressure to be everything at once. The good child, the perfect one, the hope of the family line. And here's the terrifying part. Most people never consider, you didn't choose this. It was assigned to you, and the longer you wore the mask, the more the mask started to feel like your face. But what happens when you outgrow it? What happens when the responsible firstborn becomes resentful of always having to be strong? When the invisible middle child gets tired of fading into the background? When the youngest starts to realize that freedom came with the price of not being taken seriously? When the only child starts asking whether they were raised to be a person or a projection of everyone else's needs? This is where the shadow begins to form, because everything you had to suppress in order to survive that role didn't go away. It became unconscious. The firstborn suppressed their need for help, for vulnerability, for softness. It went into the shadow. The middle child suppressed their need to be seen, their hunger for significance. It went into the shadow. The youngest suppressed their seriousness, their maturity, their right to be taken seriously. It went into the shadow. The only child suppressed their right to be imperfect, to fail, to not be everything for everyone. It went into the shadow. And here's where Jung's work becomes more crucial than ever, because the shadow isn't just the place where we hide the bad parts of ourselves. It's the place where we hide the parts that we needed most, but were told were unacceptable. And as Jung warned, what we suppress doesn't disappear. It runs our lives from the background. It shows up in self-sabotage, in patterns of choosing the wrong partners, in chronic anxiety, in rage that seems to come out of nowhere, in a gnawing sense of dissatisfaction, the quiet, haunting feeling that no matter what you do, you're never fully yourself. This is the invisible price of the birth order contract. It looks harmless from the outside, just family dynamics, just childhood. But the truth is, it becomes the lens through which you see the entire world. It shapes how you love, how you set boundaries, how you handle conflict, how you chase success, how you tolerate failure, and until you become conscious of the role you were forced into, you'll keep unconsciously playing it, over and over, in your career, in your relationships, in your inner dialogue. This isn't about blaming parents. They were following patterns too, unconscious roles passed down through generations. But understanding this isn't about blame. It's about liberation. Because once you see the pattern, you have a choice. The persona is not the self. It never was. The mask you built to survive your birth order isn't who you are. It's who you had to become. But the moment you realize that is the moment you start remembering who you were before the mask. And that's where the real journey begins. If you were the firstborn, you didn't just arrive into the world, you arrived into a world that wasn't prepared. There were no older siblings, no blueprint. You became the blueprint, you became the experiment, the living projection of all of your parents' hopes, fears, expectations, and insecurities. Whether consciously or unconsciously, your parents saw you not just as a child, but as the prototype, the one who would carry the name, the responsibility, the weight of being the example. And from the very beginning, that weight was silent, but it was real. This is how the firstborn identity forms. You learned, whether through direct messages or subtle cues, that being loved is directly connected to being responsible, being capable, being mature, being the strong one. You became the caretaker before you even understood what the word meant. Your achievements weren't just celebrated, they were expected. Your failures weren't just mistakes, they felt like betrayals. You grew up in a silent psychological contract that said, if I don't hold it all together, everything falls apart. And this burden isn't just a memory of childhood. It becomes the invisible framework of adulthood. The firstborn is often the one who becomes the overachiever, the fixer, the rescuer, the one who people lean on, not because you always want it, but because you were trained to believe that this is your role. But here's the cruel twist. The more you step into that role, the more your own needs get buried. Your vulnerability, your softness, your right to not always have it together, these parts don't disappear, they get pushed into the shadow. And that's where the real suffering begins. Because the world applauds you for being strong, for being capable, for being reliable. But inside, there's a version of you quietly screaming, when do I get to fall apart? When does someone show up for me the way I show up for everyone else? When do I get to stop performing strength and actually be held? And most firstborns never say it out loud, because the shadow voice feels dangerous. It feels like weakness. It feels like failure. You were trained to believe that being too much emotionally, or needing too much, would cost you love. This is where the anxiety lives, the perfectionism, the burnout, the chronic sense of, I'm never doing enough, because your nervous system was wired from the beginning to believe that love and safety are conditional. Conditional on performance, conditional on responsibility, conditional on holding it all together. And here's the truth that no one tells. You weren't born this way, you were programmed. You were never meant to carry this alone. But the longer you pretend you're fine, the longer the shadow grows, until it starts running your life in ways you can't see. And if this resonates, if you felt this tension inside yourself, there's a reason. And there's also a way out. That's exactly why I created the SIM method, a simple daily practice that helps you reconnect with the parts of yourself you've abandoned, reclaim your clarity, and finally stop living in survival mode. The link is in the comments if you're ready to start, because the truth is, it was never your job to carry everything, and yet you did. You became the responsible one, the achiever, the one who others could rely on. But no one ever told you that, while the world applauds the persona of the firstborn, it quietly ignores the pain underneath, the exhaustion of always holding space for everyone else, the fear of letting people down, the crushing pressure of feeling like if you rest, if you pause, if you stop, everything will fall apart. But here's the most dangerous truth that the persona doesn't want you to hear. You don't need to be perfect to be loved. You don't need to hold it all together to be safe. And the moment you start reclaiming the parts of yourself you suppressed, the need to be nurtured, to rest, to be supported, something radical happens. The mask starts to crack. The anxiety starts to loosen. The patterns begin to shift. Because the persona was never who you truly were. It was a survival strategy. And the moment you stop identifying with the role, you start remembering who you were before the role. The firstborn carries the archetype of the builder, the leader, the protector, but without balance, it can collapse into the martyr, the over-functioner, the one who sacrifices themselves in order to be good enough. And this is where shadow work begins. Not by rejecting the responsible part of you, not by burning down the persona, but by integrating it. You are more than the role you were forced to play. You are more than the caretaker, more than the achiever, more than the person who holds it, altogether for everyone else. You are allowed to put it down, and the moment you do, something profound happens. You stop living for survival, and you start living for yourself. If you were the middle child, your story started differently. You were born into a world where the stage was already set. Someone had already taken the role of the first. Someone would come later to become the last. And you were caught in between, invisible to some, misunderstood by many. Middle children often grow up feeling like they are living in the space between two worlds. Not the oldest, the responsible one. Not the youngest, the baby. You exist in a psychological gap, and that gap becomes the breeding ground for one of the most powerful yet invisible forces in the development of identity, the desperate need to be seen. From the beginning, middle children learn that attention is not guaranteed. It's not automatic. It's not handed to you the way it was for the firstborn, who had no competition, or the youngest, who came in last and often received the softest landing. You had to fight for your space. Or you had to disappear to avoid the fight. Altogether, this is where the split begins. Some middle children become the rebels, loud, disruptive, constantly challenging the system because it feels like the only way to be noticed. Others go the opposite direction, becoming the peacemakers, the invisible ones, the shapeshifters who learn how to adapt to everyone else's needs just to maintain a fragile sense of belonging. And what's tragic is that this isn't conscious. It's not something you chose. It's the contract that your psyche was forced to sign just to survive the family dynamic you were born into. From a Jungian perspective, this becomes one of the most potent origins of the fragmented self. Because the middle child often develops a highly fluid persona, the ability to become whatever the situation demands. On the surface, that sounds like a strength. Adaptability, flexibility, charm, the ability to read the room, to mediate, to negotiate. And it is, but underneath, it hides something darker, a quiet terror that says, if I am not what others need me to be, I don't exist. And that's the shadow most middle children carry, the fear of being invisible, the fear of being irrelevant, the fear of being the one who simply doesn't matter. This fear doesn't disappear when childhood ends. It follows you into adulthood, shaping how you show up in relationships, in friendships, in careers. You might become the person who always mediates conflict, the one who keeps the peace even when it hurts, the one who's constantly negotiating everyone else's needs, but forgetting your own. Or maybe you went the other way, becoming the defiant one, the person who refuses to follow rules, who pushes boundaries, who lives in a constant state of rebellion, not because you enjoy chaos, but because deep down you learned that the only way anyone paid attention was when you broke the pattern. Either way, the root is the same. A deep, unresolved hunger. To be seen, to be validated, to be recognized not for what you do for others, but simply for existing. And here's the cruel irony. The very skills that made you survive, being adaptable, being agreeable, being invisible, being the fixer, are the same skills that now make you feel unseen. Because when you become everything for everyone, you become nothing for yourself. The middle child often carries the archetype of the diplomat, the negotiator, the shapeshifter. But when the shadow grows, this archetype becomes distorted. It turns into the martyr, the self-sacrificer, the one who disappears into the needs of others, not out of love, but out of fear. And that fear whispers constantly, if I stop fixing, they'll leave. If I stop pleasing, I'll be forgotten. If I show them who I really, they won't care. This is the trauma of invisibility, a wound that isn't loud, a wound that doesn't scream, a wound that hides in smiles, in nods, in phrases like, it's fine, don't worry about me. But the truth is, you were never supposed to disappear. You were never meant to shrink yourself into a version that made everyone else comfortable. You were never meant to carry the emotional labor of your entire family or anyone else. And, maybe for the first time, no one ever told you this before. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to have needs. You are allowed to stop performing. You are allowed to stop being the glue that holds everything together. This is where the shadow begins to soften. Not by destroying the part of you that's diplomatic, kind, adaptable, but by integrating it with the part of you that's been silenced for far too long, the part that demands to be seen. And here's where everything shifts. Because the moment you start choosing yourself, not as a performance, not as a rebellion, but as an act of remembrance, the people around you either adjust or reveal that they were only ever invested in the version of you that served their needs, but that's not your burden anymore. You are not the background character in other people's stories. You are not the afterthought. You are not the filler between the first and the last. You are your own center, your own presence, your own self. And the work of reclaiming that, of unlearning the invisibility you were trained to embody, is not just healing, it's revolutionary. Because when you stop shrinking, when you stop performing invisibility, you don't just change your own life, you change the dynamic of everyone who ever benefited from you staying small. If you were the lastborn, you entered a family system that was already defined. Rules were already written, roles already taken, the structure was already in place, but instead of being crushed by it, you were positioned differently. You were welcomed, often with warmth, sometimes with indulgence, occasionally with overprotection, but always with a strange mixture of expectation and underestimation. You weren't expected to lead. You weren't required to carry the same weight of responsibility. You weren't told you had to build or maintain, only to be, to enjoy, to receive. And while that may sound like a privilege, and in many ways it is, it also comes with a psychological price most people never recognize. The lastborn learns very early that their value is often tied to lightness, to charm, to entertainment, to staying small enough not to disrupt what's already been built. You become the one who makes people laugh, the one who stays carefree, the one who avoids conflict, sidesteps responsibility, and seems easygoing. But beneath the surface, something deeper is happening. Because while everyone sees the fun, relaxed exterior, what they don't see is the pressure to maintain it, to keep being the amusing one, the lovable one, the one who doesn't cause problems. And any time you try to assert yourself, to set a boundary, to be taken seriously, to speak from a deeper place, it often gets dismissed as you being dramatic or you trying to be something you're not. So with time, you stop trying, and that's when the shadow starts to form. The shadow of the youngest child isn't about rebellion, it's about invisibility in disguise, not the invisibility that comes from being forgotten like the middle child, but the invisibility that comes from being boxed into a version of yourself that feels safe for others, but suffocating for you. Because what happens when you outgrow the expectations that you'll always be the fun one? What happens when you want to be respected, not just liked? What happens when you start to realize that the charm you used to survive is no longer enough to make you feel whole? From Jung's perspective, this is the moment where individuation becomes not only necessary, it becomes urgent, because your persona, that mask of playfulness, ease and disinterest in power, is just that, a mask. And underneath it lives the parts of you that were never allowed to fully emerge. The parts that carry vision, depth, anger, wisdom, ambition. The last-born is often underestimated by their family system, but they are rarely without power. In fact, many last-borns possess an extraordinary combination of creative intelligence, emotional awareness, and unshakable instinct. But they're trained to suppress it, because the moment they show that strength, it threatens the existing order. It threatens the image others have of them. It threatens the roles that older siblings hold. It threatens the dynamic that keeps everyone comfortable. So instead, they keep the peace. They smile, they perform, they play the clown, the sweetheart, the rebel, whatever keeps the system stable. But make no mistake, it comes at a cost. That cost often looks like delayed maturity, not because you lack capability, but because no one ever expected more. It looks like unspoken resentment, because your voice has been silenced under layers of "don't take it so seriously." It looks like chronic self-doubt, because every time you try to rise, someone reminds you, even subtly, to stay in your lane. But you were never meant to stay small. You were never meant to live in the shadow of other people's roles. You were never meant to exist as entertainment for a system that refuses to grow with you. This is the turning point. The moment where you start to listen, not to the voices outside of you, but to the fire that's been burning underneath your performance all along. The part of you that has something to say, the part that wants to be taken seriously, the part that knows you. We're born last, but that doesn't mean you're least. In fact, there's something Jung would find deeply symbolic here. The last born often carries the archetype of the transformer, the one who disrupts the system through contrast, not by obeying the structure, but by dissolving it, not by doing what's expected, but by daring to embody what no one else was willing to become. In mythology, the youngest child is often the hero. Why? Because they're the ones who see the flaws in the system, the ones who weren't indoctrinated with the same weight of responsibility or tradition. And so, they see what others cannot. But to become the hero, they must first stop pretending to be the fool. That is your work. To stop hiding behind your charm, to stop performing innocence, to stop living beneath your potential just to maintain the image others are comfortable with. Because the moment you step into your depth, when you allow your voice to be serious, your presence to be heavy, your truth to take up space, everything changes. You're no longer just the baby. You're not just the little one. You're not just the entertainer, the escape artist, or the wild card. You are the storm that brings renewal. You are the breath of fresh air the system didn't know it needed. You are the contradiction that forces everyone else to evolve. And when you claim that role, not from rebellion but from truth, you don't just free yourself, you free the entire lineage that raised you to be small. If you were an only child, you experienced something radically different from everyone else. You were not the first, you were not the middle, you were not the last. You were everything. You were the first and the last, the center and the edge, the child and the hope. In you, your parents often placed their greatest expectations and their deepest projections. Every unmet dream, every silent fear, every vision of the future. When you're the only child, there's no sibling buffer. No one to share the spotlight, no one to deflect the pressure, no one to dilute the emotional intensity that flows between you and your parents. And that intensity becomes the container where your identity is forged. On the surface, being an only child often looks like privilege, attention, resources, individual focus. You become the one who gets it all. But beneath that privilege is a complexity most people never recognize, because getting it all also means carrying it all. As an only child, you are simultaneously the golden child and the scapegoat, the pride and the disappointment, the success story and the cautionary tale. There's no one else to compare to, no one else to pass the baton to. The pressure sits quietly but heavily in your nervous system, shaping how you move through the world. From a Jungian perspective, the only child often develops an extraordinarily powerful persona, a mask of competence, of maturity beyond their years, of emotional self-sufficiency. You grow up surrounded by adults. You learn how to speak their language, how to mirror their expectations, how to become small enough to not be a burden, and yet big enough to hold their dreams. And that paradox becomes the seed of the shadow, because when you grow up learning to be everything for others, you often forget how to be anything for yourself. You learn how to anticipate, how to perform, how to please. But what you don't learn is how to rest in simply being, without needing to earn it. This is the hidden wound of the only child, the chronic, often invisible anxiety that whispers, "If I'm not everything, then I'm nothing." It's the perfectionism, the overthinking, the hyper-independence, the constant scanning of the environment to figure out what version of yourself will secure love, validation, and safety. Because there's no fallback. No sibling to blame, no older one to lean on, no younger one to protect. You are the entire emotional ecosystem of the family, and here's the most dangerous pattern. The world starts reinforcing the same dynamics. Teachers tell you you're mature for your age. Friends expect you to have it all together. Colleagues assume you're the reliable one. Romantic partners lean on you for stability, wisdom, guidance, sometimes even parentification. But while the world applauds the competent, self-sufficient version of you, it never asks, when do you get to fall apart? When do you get to be held instead of always holding? When do you get to not know and still be loved? Because underneath the competence lives exhaustion. Underneath the perfection lives loneliness, and underneath the maturity lives a child who never got permission to simply be one. This is where the shadow begins to swell, not as rage, not as rebellion, but as silent, chronic grief. A grief that most only children can't name, but feel every time they try to rest, and their nervous system won't let them. Every time they succeed but feel empty afterward, every time someone praises how strong or independent they are, and it lands not as a compliment, but as a reminder that no one is coming to help. But here's the truth. You were never meant to carry it all. That was the contract you were forced to sign. The contract that said, if I am perfect, I will be loved. If I take care of everyone else's emotions, no one will abandon me. If I never need anyone, I will never be disappointed. But the reality is, no contract built on fear ever leads to freedom. This is where the work begins, the work of individuation, the work of untangling the self from the persona, of recognizing that the mask of competence was never the self. It was the armor, an armor built for survival, an armor that served you, but an armor that has now become too heavy to carry, and the moment you start remembering the parts of yourself you abandoned, the playful part, the messy part, the uncertain part, the needy part, you start reclaiming something that was never truly lost, your humanity, your wholeness, your right to exist, not as the fulfillment of anyone's dream, but as yourself. Because you were never meant to be everything for everyone. You were meant to be you. And the moment you stop performing for love and start remembering that you were worthy of it all along, everything changes. So now you see it. The story you were living wasn't really yours. It was written for you before you even had the words to question it. Whether you were the firstborn, the middle child, the youngest, or the only child, you didn't choose the role. The role chose you. It became the invisible script that shaped your personality. It told you who you were allowed to be and who you weren't. It whispered what was safe to show and what needed to be hidden. But here's the truth no one ever told you. You were never the role. You were never the mask. You were never the persona that your birth order forced you to wear. The responsible one, the invisible one, the entertainer, the perfect one. None of that was the self. It was survival. It was a contract your psyche signed in exchange for love, safety, and belonging. But survival is not living. Survival is not freedom. And the moment you start to see the pattern, really see it, something cracks open. The mask starts to fall. The shadow starts to soften. The self, the real self, begins to emerge from the ruins of everything you were forced to become. This is the work Jung called individuation, the process of remembering who you were before the world told you who you had to be. And it's not easy. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. It feels like dying, because in a way, it is. The death of the false self, the death of the mask, but on the other side of that death is something no role can ever offer you. Freedom, wholeness, a life that actually belongs to you, because you were never just the firstborn. You were never just the middle child. You were never just the youngest. You were never just the only one. You were always something bigger, something wilder, something the roles could never contain, and now you know it.